In this edition of Generations, do you know the difference between a male and a female having a heart attack? We talk to nurse Bruce Hoffman to find out more. February celebrates World Radio Day, and Andy Russell of Hall Radio Group talks about all things radio, past and present. And Judy James from Senior Centre CT.org talks about how the boomer generation is back on top. Hello, I'm Brian Scott Smith and welcome to Generations, a podcast for people of your generation. February is American Heart Month, and did you know that men and women display different symptoms when having a heart attack? I caught up with Bruce Hoffman, who's a nurse, assistant professor at Goodwin University in Connecticut, and a volunteer for the American Heart Association, and began by asking him exactly what is a heart attack.
The heart is a muscle, and the muscle requires blood and oxygen and nutrients. And there's little blood vessels that carry that blood, nutrients, and oxygen to the heart muscle. And when those little vessels or tubes become blocked, that limits the amount of blood flow going to the heart muscle. And then the heart muscle starts to die. And that's really the major concern with a heart attack, and that's basically what a heart attack is.
Now, the other interesting thing, I didn't know this until I started doing research, is there is a difference between male heart attack and female heart attack, which, like I said, I didn't know about, and I considered myself fairly well educated. And so explain to us a little bit, if you would, about, both of those. So what would be sort of the symptomology of, say, a male heart attack?
Absolutely. So I think it's important to start out that there are symptoms that are the same between a male and a female. And these are symptoms such as chest pain or pressure. Sometimes people describe it as an elephant sitting on the center of their chest. Sometimes shortness of breath, sometimes left arm pain. People often hear that. But women in particular, and they're not totally sure exactly the reason why women experience different symptoms than men. Some people have said that it may be because women have blockages down in the smaller blood vessels of their body, whereas men tend to have blockages in the bigger vessels of their body. But we're not totally sure on that. But one thing that I think is important is that women know that they can have symptoms that are non-classic, right? They're not the same as the symptoms and signs that you might see in a male. So women in particular really need to be familiar with symptoms such as nausea or vomiting or weakness, shortness of breath, right? Even jaw or tooth pain in some cases. So it's not exactly the classic, I have pain and shortness of breath in my chest that women and men can experience, but women in particular really need to be aware of these kind of ulterior or differing symptoms.
And, when it comes to heart attack, you can have one at any age, is that right?
That's correct, yes. Typically we say if you have a history of heart disease in your family, typically around the age of 55 or younger, that really speaks to your chances of having a heart attack. We also know that there's risk factors, right? There's things like morbid obesity, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes. All of these kind of things can make somebody or predispose them to having a heart attack. But yes, you can have a heart attack at any age. Typically, we don't see them in the younger population. Typically, we see them start around 18 to 22, 23, and then all the way up until, the high 70s or 80s.
Are we starting to see more heart attack, though, because many of us, myself included, work a very sedentary sort of work life, sat in front of a computer or interviewing people. The most exercise I probably get is walking from the car to the interviewee and back sort of thing. So, are we seeing more incidences of heart attack because of these lifestyles that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple things that feed into that, right? We lead very busy lives. We're constantly on the go. That doesn't always help with eating a healthy diet. We are sitting in airplanes, we're sitting at our desks, we're sitting in our cars, so that certainly doesn't help either. But the research hasn't totally shown that a lot of some of those modifiable risk factors, as much as they can help kind of mitigate, right, your risk of having a heart attack, there's such things like genetics that play a huge role. And unfortunately, that's not something that we can adjust, right? Genetics are genetics, and that's what you're given. But I think we are starting to see more and more heart attacks. The other thing that we see is stress, right? People are under a significant amount of stress, and that also can predispose you to having a heart attack. I also think that with kind of the incidence of heart attacks going up, we've also seen the rate at which we're able to treat them go up as well, right? So there's plenty of hospital resources very close to all of us that are capable of treating a heart attack very quickly. That kind of brings me to a point that I want to illustrate, which is we say in the healthcare field that time is muscle, right? So if you're having symptoms that you believe are a heart attack, there's a couple things that we recommend. One, don't ignore it, right? Call 911 and let, experienced professionals, kind of work with you and determine whether or not you're having, a heart attack that needs treatment at a facility. The second thing is you can take aspirin, right? One baby aspirin, or even a full dose of aspirin. That's going to help kind of start to reduce the inflammation that's causing some of the clotting in that blood vessel that's obstructing that blood flow down to the heart muscle. And then the third is be willing to be treated, right? Because the longer that you go without treatment, the more heart muscle that dies, the worse your prognosis or outcome is.
I suppose another thing as well, and I'm sure you will support this obviously as a medical professional, is we should be having our yearly select physicals with our primary care provider.
I think that's essential. Yeah, you can't. I think sometimes people have a fear of going to their primary care physician or going to get checked out because they're scared of what they're going to find. And kind of, I say, what would help reduce that, that fear is finding out what's going on and then treating it. And that's kind of one of the things that I like about American Heart Association. They say instead of live and learn, it's learn and then live, which in this case kind of fits very perfectly. If you can, there's lots of resources out there from podcasts to videos, etc. There's no excuse not to get help or be aware of some of these situations.
Now, you said earlier, obviously, if you're genetically predisposed, then, unfortunately that is genetics. But lifestyle, I mean, there are things that we can do in our day-to-day lifestyle that potentially could help to reduce significantly, hopefully, the chance of heart attack. What are some of those things that we can do? Absolutely.
So those are called modifiable risk factors, right? So we can exercise 20 to 30 minutes 4 to 5 times a day. We can eat healthy, vegetables, fruits, lean meats, fish, etc. We also know that smoking is a huge risk factor for cardiac or coronary artery disease. So if you are smoking, it's better to get the treatment to help stop smoking than it is to just continue smoking because you are not able to stop. We also know limiting your stress levels is certainly very important. And then we also know that becoming educated, you can go to support groups, you can go to local offerings from your hospitals, from your medical centers that will help you kind of guide and set you up for a healthy pattern or a healthy lifestyle. The other thing that I often suggest is if you're struggling with, let's say, obesity, right? We know obesity is another risk factor. involve your family, right? Get kind of everybody on the same page. So instead of just you eating healthy, have everybody eat healthy. And I think especially in the older generation, you have grandkids coming over, you have children coming over. Set a good example for them, and at the same time, it will benefit you as well.
And I suppose the final thing to say, and obviously thank you for all of this great advice, if people do want more information, other than going to clearly see on a regular basis or a yearly basis their primary care physician, where else can they find information if they want to educate themselves?
Certainly. So you have to be careful. There's a lot of resources that are available on the internet. It's always recommended to go through credible, authoritative sources. So like the American Heart Association, they have a lot of information on their website about modifiable, about non-modifiable risk factors, about symptoms, about things to recognize.
Well, Bruce, it's been great talking to you. And of course, I suppose if you're lucky enough to have a friend like you as well, you can always, you can always speak to somebody like yourself. But in the meantime, Bruce Hoffman, assistant professor and nurse, ever so many thanks for joining us on Generations.
Thanks so much, Brian.
And for more information about heart matters, visit the American Heart Association website at heart.org. Radio has been around for over 100 years, helping to educate, inform and entertain us. And in this digital age of podcasts, it seems radio is having somewhat of a renaissance. Andy Russell is the VP and General Manager of Hall Radio Group in Eastern Connecticut, who broadcasts this podcast once a month. So who better to talk all things radio with? Andy, ever so many thanks for being on the podcast with us.
Thanks very much for including me.
So you very kindly here at Hall Communications every month broadcast the Generations podcast, for which obviously we're very grateful. So in return, we wanted to come in and obviously thank you for that, but also because February, this edition, is World Radio Day on February the 13th. So we thought who better to speak to than our broadcasting partner, Hall Communications, and yourself. How have you seen, because you've got a very long, illustrious career in broadcasting. Am I allowed to say how long it's been?
Sure.
40 years?
Yeah, it'll be 40 this summer.
Radio's changed hugely over 40 years. What would you say has been some of the changes that sort of like have stayed with you?
Well, certainly the technology has changed. I've been in the business long enough when we actually played vinyl records, and we still have some here in our building and play them from time to time. The commercials were on tape. The news was gathered on tape, whether it be cassette or reel-to-reel. Certainly that change to digital technology has been huge. And that's really been in the last 20, 25 years that we've transitioned all our audio to digital. When I first got in the business, obviously, there were no computers. And think about the impact that has had on every industry and every business out there. It certainly has here. That's what's allowed some of that digital to occur. But the daily and weekly tasks that we do that have become digitized. But I think from a programming point of view, it's also opened doors up that technology has to allow us to be a little more nimble with our programming, to certainly in the case of Hall Communications, some things that we believe in are being local, having local news on our radio stations here in Connecticut, and be that news outlet. That's something that hasn't changed over all the years I've been involved with the stations.
Do you think, I mean, we're living in a digital age, as you said, and so much of this is driven because of technology. Do you think that radio is in one of its sort of like renaissance periods again? Because, I remember, I'm originally from the United Kingdom, radio sort of like would be sort of like on top of the world, and then it was sort of like fall back sort of thing, and then we would have a renaissance again. Do you think we're in that renaissance period again?
I think to some degree, yes. I think on a local basis, we certainly are. Radio, over the last 10 years, nationwide in the United States, about 92% of the people tune into over-the-air free radio each and every week. That number's still the same. About 92, 93% of the people tune in their car, at home, at work, wherever they listen to the radio. So that number stayed. What has shifted a little bit, and some of that has to do with podcasts and other audio sources available to us over the internet and satellite radio, the time spent with free over-the-air radio may be slightly reduced. But when you look at it locally, there's nothing out there that has the ability to inform and entertain on a local level as well as radio does. We've tried to adapt to that digital world we stream our FM stations. The music stations are streamed on the internet so people can listen to them on their phone, on their computer, on their Alexa. We're finding that's picking up quite a bit. So it's an alternative. Certainly reaching the younger generation over the air and talking to our young adults that are in their 20s, they don't own radios, but they do listen to the radio, not just in their car, but they have found the other ways to listen to over-the-air radio, and they're still discovering new music on the radio, just as we did in the 60s and 70s with the Beatles and the other groups that came along on the radio.
I mean, one of the other strengths, I suppose, of Hall Communication here in Connecticut is you have, half a dozen radio stations overall.
Yep.
Sort of quite good in the segments that they hit, different demographics, a great range of music. Do you think that is one of the strengths of the group here in Connecticut?
Yeah, and that's one of the things that's changed in the industry in the 40 years I've been in it. When I started in the business, a company could only own 7 a.m. and 7 FM radio stations nationwide and 7 TVs. That changed to 14 AMs, 14 FMs, and 14 TVs. Then in the early 90s, they pulled that restriction off completely and left it to a certain number in each market. And that allowed us here in Southeast Connecticut to own the 6 stations that we own. If this were the 80s, we could not do that. And that's how it was set up. WICH and CTY here in Norwich were owned by one company. WNLC and WKNL were owned by a different company. And WILI and Willimantic were owned by a different company. They could not be co-owned at that point in time. So you had a whole bunch of owners. I think that was honestly better for the industry to have some restrictions nationally. I think the number we have here in this market, to your point of it gives us the ability to offer a variety of formats in this community. We can share resources within the building in order to accomplish that, whereas it would be more difficult to do that if you only had 2 stations.
One of the other things, of course, with radio originally, and a lot of local commercial radio did away with this, many years ago, and that's news, because news is expensive. Mm-hmm. It costs to gather news. Mm-hmm. But, of course, we're seeing newspapers dying out. Do you see your local news as one of your strong points as part of your overall lineup?
Definitely. But it is expensive and it is challenging, and it's hard to monetize it. And as much as we do have some local sponsors who support our newscasts, but we as a company feel, particularly in this market, it's important and it fits because of the size of the market. We don't have any local TV. We do have 2 local daily papers, but the immediacy that we're able to deliver the news exceeds what they can do with the newspapers. So, we feel it is an attraction for people to listen, more people to tune into our stations. We hope it is, even though there are a lot of different ways today that people can get their news, both locally and nationally. I
mean, Eastern Connecticut, which is really your base of operations, yep. It's one of those areas which certainly, as you say, some of the broadcasters do forget. Mm-hmm. But mistakenly so, because I think, when you live here and you listen to, Hall Communication, you read the newspapers to which you've mentioned, there is a huge amount that goes on in Eastern Connecticut.
It certainly is.
Which people just don't realize.
Yeah. Obviously there's a lot goes on statewide as well, but, here we've got a few of the state's largest employers between General Dynamics, the casinos, lead the state, a number of employees that they have. We have a transportation center in New London that has train, that has the rail, that has the ferries. It's right off 95, so there's access there. There is a lot going on in this region all the time, and it does somewhat get forgotten by Hartford, both from the media as well as from the capital, quite a bit.
So here's the million-dollar question, of course. Radio, like we said, has its resurgence. It's over 100 years old. Obviously, newspapers are older than radio, but, radio's the next oldest medium. Where do you see it going? I mean, what sort of trends are you seeing, that you think is going to happen maybe in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think the trend that's been with us for the last 5 or 10 years that's shown the companies that remain successful are the ones that keep it as local as they possibly can. And I think that's, our company's commitment has been to, in as many aspects as we can, keeping it local, keeping local people on the radio stations that live in Eastern Connecticut, that know Eastern Connecticut, that their kids go to school with our listeners' kids, they go to church, they go to restaurants with their listeners. Sometimes the listeners don't know that radio person's sitting at the next table unless they talk and they recognize their voice. But I think what the localism is really what will keep radio moving forward in a positive way.
Do you also think maybe like the podcasts, sort of like everyone seems to be into podcasts at the moment, do you think also podcasts is sort of just re-energizing radio a little bit? Because really it's radio with just a different name. Yeah,
and I think that extends the day because people are busy out there. People can't tune in and listen to Stu Breyer's show necessarily on WICH or Wayne Norman on WILI, but they want to hear who they interviewed and what they had going on that day. And they can then listen to it when they want to listen to it. So it's appointment radio. It's no different than having a DVR that's recording your favorite show. We do it for them. And then there it is. And, you can listen to it when you want to, and you can focus on it as opposed to when you're running from here and there.
Well, Andy Russell, Vice President and General Manager of the Hall Communications Group here in Connecticut. Again, thank you ever so much, obviously, for the support that you give to this podcast. And obviously, we wish, Hall Communication and the radio stations here another good 100 years of broadcasting.
We look forward to it. Thanks very much, Brian.
So joining us as always is Judy Jenks from seniorcenterct.org. Judy, lovely to see you again.
Hello, Brian. How are you today?
I'm good, thank you very much. Now, so what are you going to talk to us about? What's your ode this month of February?
We are talking about baby boomers and the change they continue to create. And for those of you who aren't certain, baby boomers are the children that were born after World War II. As the soldiers returned and married, there was a population explosion, creating a baby boom, thus the name baby boomers. These babies were born between 1946 and 1964. They are now between the ages of 55 and 75, and there are more than 76 million baby boomers. As this bunch moved through the different stages of life, society needed to adapt to accommodate the vast number. Schools were built, TV programming was geared towards them, advertising was directed towards them. They protested the Vietnam War, held sit-ins. Woodstock, the Beatles, and TVs in every home happened because of the boomers. And now society needs to continue to adapt as this massive group moves through the third stage of life. This group is competitive, self-assured, goal-oriented, and has a strong sense of community. They are independent and make up their own mind. They're smart, confident, and do their own research. Plus, they don't part with their money easily. As they become retirees, changes will continue to develop and evolve. Boomers will need everything retirees have always consumed, but in much greater number and in a much different way. One example is the boomers are generally staying in their homes, not going to Florida, not relocating, but aging in place. Baby boomers will live better than the generations before them as they live and work longer. Baby boomers also had smaller families and are apt to be alone when their care needs change. Society will need to again adapt and change to fill the void all of this will create. They will have more needs than the present aging system can supply. The current workforce will not be able to support this group's future needs. We already see some of these changes starting with the resourceful development of new ways to do things. Uber and Lyft offer the beginnings of affordable on-demand transportation. Technology offers assistance in varying degrees. Alexa, Fitbit, telemedicine, and fall monitors all offer various levels of help. We even have a TV we can talk to, and new devices are being developed and promoted as we speak. Updates continue to be made to existing devices and apps weekly. The more we're able to talk with devices, the more support we can get at a very low cost. They are not the robots we pictured as we watch the Jetsons, but we can vacuum with iRobot, see who's at the front door with Ring, call for help with our medical alert, change the channel on the TV, play music, make phone calls, monitor the thermostat, and more with Alexa, even start our cars with smartphones. What will we be doing with devices in, say, 5 years? As baby boomers strive to live their lives, they imagined, and maintain their independence, they will be looking for those companies and products that market to them. They want companies that provide useful information, have clickable ads, give better than average customer service, companies that understand $3+ trillion of disposable income is in the hands of the baby boomers. Will win those boomers over with targeted marketing campaigns. One excellent example is SeniorCenterCT.org, a collective website that's easy to navigate and filled with useful information designed for baby boomers. There is much more on the horizon, so when we look at change, be sure to welcome it.
Very wise words. It is amazing, actually, when you look at the demographic today, as you say, until you break it down, you don't realize that it is an older society out there, and the older society is in the majority.
And another amazing fact that I just came across is in 2025, it is projected that the older population will outnumber children 13 and under.
Wow.
Amazing. And another thing, I think it was in 1955, the average woman had 3.77 children. So there were 4 children to a family. And now that number was just released that women are at 1.6 babies. So we have gone from a family of 4 children down to 1 to 2.
Well, it's a costly thing these days, isn't it? The world has become a more expensive place as well.
Yeah. So, and if you remember back with the boomers, there was a big movement about only replacing yourself and not having more than 2 children. And now we're at less than 2 children to a family.
It will be interesting. Will we have like the China effect in a few years' time where, of course, the Chinese culture restricted the amount of children that you had. And now, of course, they've got an issue because of that particular policy. Now, could we see that in the Western world in the future as people maybe have less children?
And another interesting thing that we should look at and we should watch is millennials. Did they delay having their children, and will there be a little baby boom as they now are reaching their 30s and headed towards 40? Did they delay their children, and now will they have 2 or 3 kids? It'll be interesting to see what they do.
It will be. Well, as always, great to see you, and a fabulous topic. Thank you ever so much for that, and we'll catch you next episode.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian.
That's all from this edition of Generations. Don't forget to visit SeniorCenterCT.org to find out what's going on in your neck of the woods. And if you want to send us a topic to talk about or want to be our guest on the podcast, drop us a line by visiting the SeniorCenterCT.org website. Go to the bottom of the homepage and click the How to Advertise with Us link to get in touch. From myself, Brian Scott Smith, thanks for listening. We'll catch you next time.